It's time for Dodger Baseball!
I'm at Dodger Stadium, and it's Mexican-American Heritage Night. Celebrate Mexican culture and heritage at Dodger Stadium on Tuesday as the boys in blue take on the Pirates at 7:10 p.m. This ticket package includes your ticket to the game and an exclusive Mexican Heritage Night jersey. That's the jersey. They should totally do the Los Doyers jersey. And there's gonna be a mariachi band. Okay then. So baseball's always been my sport of choice, and one of the things I love most about the game, especially these days, is how multicultural it is. It's maybe not the global game that soccer is, but if you love baseball, you're gonna share that love with people from all over the place. You know, it's hard for me to think of a team that has as solid of a Chicano fan base as the Dodgers, and you can see this from the LA hats all over Boyle Heights to the makeup of the stands during a Dodgers game, and I love it. Yeah, it's easy to think of the Dodgers as this team that's regularly on the right side of history, from Jackie Robinson to Roy Campanella, and so much of the time they were, but it hasn't always been that way. See, before the era of Mookie Betts and Clayton Kershaw, before Hyunjin Ryu and Yasiel Puig, or Adrian Gonzalez and Matt Kemp, Gary Sheffield, Chan-Ho Park, before Mike Piazza and Hideo Nomo, there was
Fernando Valenzuela.
Fernando Mania. See, Fernando comes from rural Mexico, just this really small village, and he has this crazy pitch, a screwball. It's like this curveball that moves in reverse motion, and it's fooling everybody. He's striking guys out. He starts his season by winning 8 games in a row.
I think that Fernando Valenzuela is the best. He's the greatest, and I think everybody here has Fernando fever.
You had to go to the game. And literally, when the police would stop you, if Fernando was playing, they wouldn't say, "What are you doing?" They go, "Why aren't you at the park?" You know, because you were doing something wrong if you weren't at the baseball park.
The history of Fernando Mania makes it really easy to forget that it wasn't always like this. I mean, these days, about 50% of the stands at a Dodgers game are going to be Latino. But prior to Fernando Valenzuela, that number was more like 10%.
You know, a lot of the Mexican Americans, they said, "Hey, forget the Dodgers, we're done."
One who is still extremely bitter about what happened during that time, who still would not go to a game because of Chavez Ravine.
I'll never go again. I hated it. I didn't enjoy it. It was like dancing on a grave.
So why would have LA Latino families, who today make up a large portion of the Dodger fan base, have been so against the team for so long? It's because the Dodgers kicked a bunch of them out of their homes. You mean like metaphorically, right? Like they made the prices go up and everything got expensive and gentrification and all that. No. I mean like literally. They literally picked them up and carried them out of their homes. They physically, by force, moved people out of their homes, and then they ran over those homes with a bulldozer, all so they could build this place. Okay, so this video is kind of sort of about the Dodgers, more than the Dodgers, but it involves the team, and it doesn't exactly portray them in the most flattering light. So I want to clarify a few things first. I'm not a Dodgers fan. I'm not a hater either, just not a fan. Full disclosure, I'm a Phillies fan. I know some folks who are Dodgers fans who seem to think our teams are big rivals. I don't really get that. There are like 10 other teams I dislike more than the Dodgers. The Dodgers are firmly in my zone of apathy. I root against them when we're going head to head, and I cheer for them when they can beat another team and help us get into the playoffs. It's like that. Also, while the Dodgers do play in that stadium, which got a bunch of Mexican families kicked out of their homes, it's not like Sandy Koufax and Duke Snider are directly responsible for that. This has more to do with the seas of change swirling around the US at that point and a number of different actors. And this isn't just a baseball story. It's an LA story. It's a story about the US in the 1950s, McCarthyism, and the Red Scare. It's a story about public housing, good intentions gone wrong, and bad intentions gone really, really wrong. It's about redlining and racism and opportunity and the importance of calling a place home. It's about the American dream, the mythology of moving west, and the times we shut our eyes to the fact that others were here first. And it's also all literally right over there at Dodger Stadium. So this story really begins in the 1930s with the New Deal. To come out of the Great Depression, the New Deal also established the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, which introduced this practice we know as redlining. In theory, the HOLC was to support a middle class by helping a bunch of families build wealth through home ownership. And it did that for millions of families, but only certain families. The agency started color-coding city neighborhoods based on the desirability of each neighborhood. In other words, this was a very thinly veiled way of talking about a neighborhood's racial composition. All white neighborhoods were colored in green, blue and yellow places were homogeneous, and then you had these red neighborhoods, which, according to the actual language used by this agency, were infiltrated by an undesirable population. Banks used these maps to decide how they would give out loans, which meant that families in red neighborhoods, pretty much black families, were unable to become homeowners. Now, a Mexican-American family living in Southern California about a century ago would have ran into this problem as well. With hardly any options for housing, many started to simply head towards the hills and started building up homes and encampments on a ravine right on the edge of downtown. And before you know it, a few semi-rural communities began to emerge. It's kind of weird thinking of these as rural communities because it looks smack in the middle of LA, and if you check out a map, a freeway goes right around it. It feels very urban. But back then, it wasn't. At the time, people here grew their own food. They raised pigs, goats, turkeys, and chickens in the backyard, and eventually got their own grocery store. They had a church, an elementary school, and these neighborhoods became known as La Loma, Bishop, and Palo Verde. Now remember, these families were pretty much excluded from every other neighborhood because of racism and redlining, and yet they still found a way to thrive. Generations grew up there. It just became the sort of place where you would leave your door unlocked.
You know everybody like a big family.
Unfortunately, not everyone saw the beauty of these neighborhoods. To a lot of outsiders, they were simply slums. But to the families living there, this was home. This was forged out of undesirable circumstances, and yet they built something special. They built community. And unfortunately, others couldn't see it.
They tell the whole city that the Chavez Ravine was nothing but shacks.
To the people of Chavez Ravine, families like the Arechigas, this was home. And they'd hoped it would always be home. Now this is Frank Wilkerson, and to him, La Loma, Bishop, and Palo Verde represented an opportunity to improve lives. This is Walter O'Malley, who owned the Brooklyn Dodgers, and to him, this land was an opportunity to move his team to the West Coast. To this guy, Congressman Norman Paulson, this land represented an opportunity for political gain. The Dodgers got caught up in all of this, and it was happening against the backdrop of racism, of the Red Scare, and of the frenzy of moving west. But let's start the story with this guy, Frank Wilkerson. Wilkerson was the son of a minister, and he grew up comfortably middle class. After he graduated from college, he took himself on a world tour. He traveled through Europe, through Northern Africa, and through Middle East. After seeing so much, he felt burdened with this desire to do something to help people, and with a lot of new ideas as to how that could happen. He looked at Jane Addams' settlement house in Chicago that was one of the early cornerstones of American social work, and saw that as inspiration. He gets really into the idea of public housing. He looks at the communities on Chavez Ravine, he sees slums, and he thinks those families could and should live in something much better. He decides that his first big public housing undertaking is going to happen right there. In so many ways, Frank Wilkerson reminds me of the well-intentioned idealist who just has this burning desire to do good, but kind of skips the steps of spending time with the communities and getting to know what matters to them and what their real concerns are. I mean, you still see this all the time today, don't you?
Paternalism is habitually doing for people and providing for people things that they can do and provide for themselves. Let me come in and kind of do this for you. So our church comes here and we're going to do VBS over there the way it should be done. Or we're going to come build this the way it should be built. And that's detrimental.
Wilkerson teams up with some developers, and they put together this plan and this pitch for an elaborate housing complex called Elysian Heights. You can still see in the drawings how sleek and novel this place looked. There were 13-story buildings with different dwelling units inside. There were townhomes, professional landscaping, even little spaces for stores and businesses. It's almost like he's ahead of his time in envisioning what Southern California ends up looking like today, except, with less population density. But you see, to a lot of the families at Chavez Ravine, his plan looked nothing like their sense of home. A generation or two ago, these families were goat herding and practicing animal husbandry right in their front yards on dirt roads. It might have been LA, but the LA these families knew was rural flavored. Well, the city of LA decides they're going to do this anyway, so they pass something called eminent domain, which means they can claim somebody's land as long as they're fairly compensated. The city started by offering cash to locals to move out and eventually move back into the public housing once it was built, but no one was too excited about this. The response was tepid, and people were really slow to actually accept that cash offer. The city tried the strategy of offering less and less money, making it seem like the longer you wait, the less you get paid, to build a sense of urgency among these families. Little by little, people started leaving the area, and it really did seem like public housing was imminent. Until it wasn't.
Wilkerson's plans had a new snag. This time it wasn't residents' reluctance, but 1950s politics.
And when I say 1950s politics, I'm largely talking about the Red Scare and McCarthyism. In order to win, politicians were playing into this fear and hysteria surrounding socialism and communism, and then doing everything they could to link their opponents to those ideologies. Private real estate groups were really threatened. They saw this as a threat to the value of the houses that they were selling. And also, a lot of people at the time believed that lower income communities would affect the value and desirability of other homes. So these groups did everything in their power to lean into the conversation that connected public housing with communism. They branded public housing as un-American, and they made sure that any officials heavily involved in public housing were deeply investigated for communist activities, including Frank Wilkerson.
I did not know that the FBI had been following me until 11 years ago when I was 65 years of age. And I got the first 4,500 pages of it. It seemed to deal entirely with my early work in integration in housing. The FBI then told the judge that they had a total of 132,000 pages of surveillance on me over 38 years.
Their efforts to investigate and incriminate every public housing official weren't always successful, but they were really successful at shaping public opinion. Very quickly, a lot of Americans developed a somewhat fearful view of public housing. People worried that it would lower their property values, that it would invite undesirable problems into their neighborhoods, and that it would open the door for communism to take hold. Norman Paulson, a congressman at the time, ran to be the mayor of LA. His whole platform was in opposition to public housing. His victory ended up being the final nail in the coffin for the grand vision of Elysian Heights. The city ended up buying the land back from its developers for a way lower price than they paid for it.
LA now owned Chavez Ravine, but it still had this condition where the land had to be used for public interest. Also, there were still a few families living here. The developer may have given some of the families cash to leave, but not all of them took the offer. Some remained, and these were the obstinate holdouts. Now, in spite of their firmness, their resistance, it became really clear that things were changing. This was no longer the neighborhood they grew up in. A lot of families had left, and there was a ton of uncertainty about what the future would hold. Speaking of changes, things were really changing in the baseball world. You had all these East Coast teams suddenly moving west. The Giants went from New York to San Francisco. The A's went from Philadelphia to Kansas to Oakland. More and more teams were moving as baseball became a nationwide game, coast to coast. Now, if you look at any of these moves individually, they just seem like business decisions. The Giants moved because the place where they played was becoming depopulated, while families were moving more suburban. But if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, these really just reflect the broader trends of the US at the time. More people were moving to the West Coast. More people were moving to suburban locations. These followed the trends of jobs after World War II. And transcontinental flights were making it more and more possible for baseball to be a game played on both coasts. So Walter O'Malley was the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and after his attempts to get a new stadium built for the team were unsuccessful, he finally was forced to make good on his threats to leave town. In 1957, the move became official. The team started by playing its games at the LA Coliseum, which was always meant to be a temporary solution until they found a more permanent home. In 1957, the communities that lived here in the Chavez Ravine were down to about 20 families, but these were the most persistent holdouts. They posted signs in their front yards and got their stories picked up by the local newspapers. They crafted the narrative as them being the sympathetic families being kicked out by city bureaucrats and big business. It was a classic David and Goliath situation. One family in particular, the Arechiga family, became like the center of the resistance. Their home was the last stand of Palo Verde. The city officials who were trying to cast a campaign to clear this land cast a campaign on the Arechiga family in particular, using Red Scare tactics, trying to portray them as having ulterior motives, pointing to the fact that they owned other assets to try and cast doubt on their whole underdog image. And in 1958, an election was held. The most talked about item on the ballot was easily Proposition B. While the city of LA owned Chavez Ravine, it was given to them under the condition that it had to be used for public good. They needed to vote to approve the sale of the land to Walter O'Malley to build Dodger Stadium. This was the largest turnout for a non-presidential election in Los Angeles history, and the results were close. The margin of victory was slim, just about a 3% difference. About 25,000 voters decided that Dodger Stadium would be built. Construction would take place in 1959, and this was practically the final nail in the coffin for families like the Arechigas. They fought to the bitter end, and I do mean the bitter end. They literally had to be carried out of their houses. If they couldn't win their fight against the city, they could at least cement this inhumane image of an eviction in the minds of Los Angeles for generations to come. You can see what's happened to the communities. These days it's mostly a baseball stadium and city parks. And generations of those original occupants have come and gone since. People who had ancestral ties. The descendants of those who lived in La Loma, in Bishop, and Palo Verde still meet and gather and remember the times they spent here. They're known as Los Desterrados de Chavez Ravine, or Chavez Ravines Uprooted.
You know what? We were happy. We were happy people.
So what now? I mean, the families of Chavez Ravine were wronged by so many different people so many different times. Before it was the city and the Dodgers, it was the public housing developers. And before them, it was redlining and racial discrimination. Also, this was all so long ago. So what good does it do for us to re-examine these stories? We're now generations removed. Are we just trying to ruin our ability to enjoy baseball? I think this is an example of a situation where even though we can't do anything to change it, we can at least choose to see the impact it had on people whose lives were really affected because of it. If you've been wronged or harmed, you know it makes a big difference to just have your experience seen and validated and acknowledged. The other big reason why this still matters to talk about today is that a lot of the same building blocks that led to this incident are all still there. They didn't go anywhere. We've never really taken a serious step to address the disparities created by redlining. We still see a lot of people following suit to Frank Wilkerson with these big plans and desires to help people without taking their perspectives or agency into account. And we still have political figures using manipulative talking points pretty much right out of the McCarthy playbook. You have people who look at diverse communities as slums just by default or out of habit. You still have sports team owners looking for new homes and people who are going to be displaced in order to build a stadium. But now that we know what this injustice looks like, maybe we're at least better suited to do something about it the next time it strikes. So I gotta give credit to the book that taught me a lot of the story. It's called Stealing Home by Eric Nussbaum. It goes deep. It does a deep dive into the people involved, this whole story, and it's a really neat portrait of LA right around the 1950s and its history, its Mexican origin, its baseball fandom, all that. If you like stories like these, or if you like stories about nature, culture, and adventure, then like, subscribe, and follow along for more. We got 2 videos coming out every month, and I will see you in the next one.